The library at Crossholt smelled of cold ash and older paper, and Miss Eleanor Vane stood before the portrait of a dead man with a lamp in her hand and a lie pressing against her ribs. The house had been counted, catalogued, and half sold in the 4 weeks since the funeral, and she had been permitted to remain only because someone was needed to keep the ledger straight while the estate was dismantled around her. She was the poor cousin. She was the one the family forgot to grieve. On the morning of the reading of the will, in the crowded morning room with rain streaking the tall windows, the solicitor had cleared his throat and named her nothing at all, and Lady Margaret Crossholt had turned to her sister and said softly, so that it carried, that the girl had always been a small, useful shadow, and would go on being one somewhere else. Eleanor had not wept. She had learned that weeping was a thing observed and priced. Instead, she had memorized the shape of the sentence, the way one memorizes the placement of a stair in a dark house, and she had gone on adding columns of figures that did not add to what they should. That was the thing she could not say aloud. The columns were wrong. The estate that everyone believed her late guardian had left in ruin had not been ruined at all, and the will that gave everything to his nephew read, in its final clause, in a hand that was almost her guardian's and was not, that he had signed it of his own free mind on a date when he had already lost the use of his right hand. She lifted the lamp higher. The portrait looked back at her. Sir Henry Ashcombe in his prime. Before the illness, one hand resting on a book she had watched him read 100 times. There was a draft behind the canvas that there had never been before. She had noticed it a week ago and told herself it was nothing. Tonight, she did not tell herself it was nothing. You should know, before this goes any further, that a house in mourning keeps its secrets in the walls and gives them up only to the person patient enough to listen. Stay with her a moment. She is about to learn what the draft means. Behind the portrait, where the paneling did not quite meet, her fingers found a seam. Tes. She pressed it, and a section of the wall gave inward, with the sigh of a thing long shut, and in the shallow dark beyond it lay a folded paper sealed with wax she recognized. It was Sir Henry's true seal, the one he had kept in the locked drawer of his own desk, the one no clerk had ever been permitted to touch. Her hand shook. She did not let herself open it there. She heard below her the sound of a carriage on the gravel, arriving late and unannounced, and she slid the panel shut and stepped back from the wall as though she had done nothing at all. The man who came into Crossholt out of the rain that night was the last man in England she wished to see, because he was the only one who frightened her more than the family did. He was Marcus Ashcombe, the new Earl of Rethwell, Sir Henry's nephew, the beneficiary of the will she now believed to be a forgery, and he stood in the hall shaking water from a dark coat while the footman took his gloves. And he looked at her across the length of the flagstones as though he had expected to find her there and was deciding what to do about it. He was tall and still in the way that stone is still, and his face gave her nothing. The family had a name for him too. Lady Margaret had used it that first week, in the drawing room, over tea, with the confidence of a woman who has never been contradicted by anyone she considered her equal. He is a cold creature, she had said, and colder since the war, and Eleanor had watched the rival for the season's attention, Miss Cordelia Frost, arrange herself prettily and agree that a title could forgive a great deal of coldness. Eleanor had said nothing. She had thought only that a man who had inherited a fortune he did not need had no reason to notice whether a poor cousin lived or starved. He noticed the lamp still warm in her hand. She saw him see it. He said nothing about it, and that was worse than a question. He crossed to her, unhurried, and stopped at a proper distance, and he said that he had come because the accounts troubled him, and he would be obliged if she would show them to him in the morning. His voice was low and level and gave no more away than his face had. "Come and sit," he said. "You have been standing in a cold room. Eat something." It was a command, and she heard only the command. She did not yet hear the care folded inside it, the way one does not at first hear a clock in a quiet house until the ticking becomes the only sound there is. That night she lay awake with the sealed paper hidden beneath the loose board under her bed and listened to the rain, and she thought of the crooked signature on the will downstairs, and she made a decision that a wiser woman in her position would not have made. She would find out the truth. She would find it out whatever it cost her, because Sir Henry had been the only person in that house who had ever spoken to her as though she had a mind, and she would not let a forger sign his name to a lie and go unchallenged, even if no one in England would take the word of a girl who owned nothing but the clothes she stood in. Cross Holt in the years of Eleanor's girlhood had not been a house of shadows. She had come to it at 12, an orphan with a trunk and a Latin grammar, the daughter of Sir Henry's disgraced younger sister, and she had waited to be told she was a burden. She remembered the arrival still, the long gray drive under dripping limes, the great door that seemed made for someone larger than herself, the housekeeper's mouth pressed into a line that said the girl would not stay long. She had stood in the hall with her wet trunk at her feet and prepared herself, as a child of poverty learns to prepare herself, to take up as little room as she could and to be grateful for whatever she was given and to expect that it would be little. Sir Henry had told her instead to sit down and read to him. He had been in the library, an old man even then, with a rug across his knees and a book open on a stand, and he had looked at her over the top of his spectacles and said that her mother had read to him once, long ago, before the family quarrel that no one now living quite remembered the cause of, and that he supposed the daughter had a tongue in her head as well. She had read to him, stumbling from a page of Cowper, and when she read well he had said so, and when she read badly he had corrected her without unkindness, and in this way a friendship had grown between an old man and a child that neither of them ever named. He gave her the run of the library, which no one else in the house wanted. He gave her paper and let her spoil it. When Lady Margaret, visiting, remarked that it was an odd education for a girl who would need to earn her bread, Sir Henry had answered that a mind was a poor thing to starve on purpose, and had said no more about it. He taught her the accounts, because his eyes were failing and he trusted no one else with them. He would sit beside her at the long desk in the study and name the columns while she wrote them, the Michaelmas rents and the Lady Day rents, the price of wool and the cost of drainage in the low meadow, the small pensions he paid to servants too old to work, and had never entered in any ledger a solicitor would see, because they were nobody's business but his own. He taught her the estate, its tenants and its debts, and its quiet decencies, which cottages leaked and which widows were behind and were not to be pressed, and she had assumed, in the unthinking way of the young, that this would go on forever. It had not gone on forever. The illness came in the autumn of her 20th year, quietly, a numbness in the fingers that he made light of, and then less quietly, until the right hand would no longer close upon a pen and the arm hung useless at his side. He had borne it with a dry patience that was harder to watch than complaint would have been. In his last year he had signed nothing without her holding the paper steady beneath his ruined hand, guiding it as one guides a child's, while he shaped with enormous effort the letters that had once come easily, and the signature that resulted was a broken thing, cramped and trembling and unlike itself, the H of Henry collapsing into the rest. She knew that broken signature, as she knew her own face in a glass, because she had watched it made 100 times, had blotted it, had folded the papers away. And she knew, therefore, as no one else in England knew, exactly what his signature looked like when made by a hand that could no longer be trusted to make it, and exactly what it did not look like. The clause on the false will downstairs was neither the firm slanting hand of his health, nor the cramped ruin of his illness. It was a careful imitation of the first, made by someone who had studied an old letter and never seen the last hard year at all. That was the wound the family had handed her, and did not know they had handed her. She was the one person in the world who could recognize the forgery, and she was the one person no one would ever believe. The morning after Marcus arrived, she brought the ledgers to the study and laid them before him, and she watched his hands as he turned the pages, and she found she could not read him at all. He asked precise questions. Why did the tenant rents fall by 1/3 in the final quarter? Why was there no record of the timber sold from the North Wood? Why did the sum the solicitor named as the whole of the estate's worth differ from the sum the ledgers implied by a figure large enough to buy a smaller house outright? She answered what she could and said of the rest that she did not know, which was true, and that she was only the cousin who kept the books, which was the sentence the family had taught her to say. He looked at her then directly, for longer than was comfortable. "You know more than you are saying," he said. It was not an accusation. It was almost gentle. She held his gaze because she had learned that to look away was to confess, and she said that she knew only what the figures showed, and the figures showed that money had left the estate that ought to have stayed in it. Something moved behind his eyes. He closed the ledger. He said that she should not repeat what she had told him to anyone in the house, and particularly not to his aunt. And he said it in the flat tone of a man giving an order, and she bristled at it even as some deeper part of her understood that she had just been protected. "Do not go into the North Wood alone," he said. "Do not walk the corridors after the house is abed. If you find anything, bring it to me." She said that she took no orders from him. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, a shift at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully arrived, and it undid something in her chest that she resented with her whole heart. The dismissive word found her again 3 days later, and this time it was Miss Cordelia Frost who spoke it, in the long gallery before a half-dozen guests come out from town for the shooting. Eleanor had been sent to fetch a shawl and had come upon them all arranged among the old paintings, and Cordelia, without troubling to lower her voice, had observed to the company that it was a charming economy of the family to keep a shadow who could also do sums, and that she supposed every great house needed one useful ghost. The guests had laughed, the easy laugh of people to whom cruelty costs nothing. Eleanor had handed over the shawl and turned to go, and she had felt before she saw it that Marcus was in the doorway and had heard. He did not defend her. That was the thing she turned over afterward, in the dark. He said nothing at all. He only looked at Cordelia with a stillness that emptied the gallery of laughter within the minute. And then he asked Eleanor, in front of them all, whether she would do him the courtesy of reviewing a matter of business in the study, as though her time were a thing of value that the company had been wasting. It was not a defense. It was worse than a defense, because a defense she could have dismissed as pity, and this she could not dismiss as anything at all. In the study he did not speak of the gallery. He had crossed to the window and stood a moment with his back to her, looking out at the rain on the park, and when he turned, he had mastered whatever had emptied the laughter from the room, and his face was again the still stone thing she had first seen in the hall. He set before her a letter, old. The ink browned at the folds, and asked whether she recognized the hand. She bent over it. It was Sir Henry's true hand, from years before the illness, firm and slanting and entirely itself, and it was addressed to a name she did not know, and it spoke of a debt of gratitude and a promise kept, and she read no further than she was meant to. She said that yes, it was Sir Henry's writing, from before he fell ill. He took it back before she had finished the sentence and folded it away into his breast pocket, and his fingers rested against the place where it lay for a moment longer than the motion required. The flat of his hand pressed briefly to his own coat as though to be certain the paper was still there. She understood, without being told, that the letter was not about the estate at all, or not only about it. It was a thing he carried on his person, the way a man carries a thing he cannot leave in a drawer. She did not ask. She had her own paper hidden under a board, and she, of all people, knew that some griefs are kept and not shared, and that to reach for another person's grief uninvited is a kind of theft. She only noted, and put away in the careful ledger she kept behind her eyes, that the cold Earl of Rethwell carried something next to his heart that could still move him, and that she had seen it move. He asked her before she went whether she was warm enough in the room they had given her, the small one at the north end above the kitchen passage. She said that she was. He looked at her as though he knew the room and knew that no one could be warm in it, and he said that he would have a better one opened for her, and she said that it was not his to open. And he said, evenly, that a great many things at Crossholt were not what they were supposed to be and left it there. She did not understand him then. She would understand him later, and the understanding would cost her a night's sleep. That night she opened a sealed paper at last. Alone, with the door barred and a candle guttering, and she read it 3 times before her hands would stop trembling. It was a will. It was Sir Henry's true will, dated 8 months before his death, in the firm hand of a man whose right side still obeyed him, witnessed by the vicar and by the steward, both now conveniently dismissed from the estate. It left the house and the greater part of the fortune not to his nephew, and not to Lady Margaret, but to Eleanor, the daughter of the sister. He had never stopped loving, with a single line beneath the bequest that broke her more thoroughly than any cruelty had. He had written that she had been the truest company of his last years, and that he could not, in conscience, leave her to the mercy of people who would never see her worth. She sat on the floor with the paper in her lap, and wept at last, silently, the way she had trained herself to weep, and she understood the whole shape of the thing now. Someone had found this will, or feared it existed, and had made another, and had forged the failing signature of a dying man onto a lie, and had counted on the poor shadow cousin being too small and too frightened to do anything but keep the books and go quietly when she was sent away. They had misjudged the shadow. The question was who? Lady Margaret had the motive and the malice, but Lady Margaret could not have forged a signature she had never studied. The solicitor had the skill and the access, but the solicitor had no reason to favor the nephew over the aunt. And the nephew had inherited everything. The false will gave away, and the nephew had come to Crossholt in the rain, the very night she found the panel, and the nephew had told her to bring anything she found to him, and no one else. She lay awake and let the suspicion coil in her. Because to suspect him was safer than the other thing her body kept insisting upon, which was that when he issued his flat protective commands, her pulse answered them before her mind could refuse. The next weeks were a slow tightening. Lady Margaret, sensing something she could not name, moved to have Eleanor removed from the house entirely, and produced with great ceremony a letter of character that recommended the girl for a governess's position in Northumberland, 300 miles distant, to be taken up within the fortnight. It was done sweetly, at breakfast as a kindness. The season had no place for her, Lady Margaret said, and it was unkind to keep a young woman idle, when honest work waited. Cordelia had smiled into her chocolate. The shadow was being swept from the corner where it had lodged too long. Eleanor understood that she had until the fortnight was out to prove a dead man's true wishes, or lose the house forever, and she understood that she could prove nothing alone. And so she did the thing that cost her the most, which was to trust a man she had every reason to suspect. She went to Marcus in the study, and she laid the true will on the desk in front of him, and she watched his face, to see him become her enemy. He went very still. He read it once, and then again, and when he looked up his face had changed in a way she had never seen it change, and for the first time since he had come out of the rain, she saw the whole of what he kept behind the stillness. He was not surprised by the will. He was surprised that she had found it. And in the single unguarded moment before he mastered himself again, she saw grief in him so old and so specific that she knew it had nothing to do with Crossholt at all. He told her the thing then, because there was no longer any way not to. He drew the chair out for her and made her sit, and he stood by the cold hearth with the true will in his hand, and told it plainly, without softening and without excuse. He had come to Crossholt not to claim the estate but to give it back. He had known for a year that a wrong had been done to someone under this roof, because a dying steward had written to him from a poorhouse in Kent, in a hand grown shaky with fever and want, to confess that he had witnessed a true will and then been paid to swear he had witnessed a false one. The steward had taken the money and left the county and had never had a quiet hour since, and had carried the guilt to the very edge of his grave and could carry it no further, and had written to the new earl because the new earl was the one man the theft had enriched and therefore the one man who might make it right or might bury it forever. And the dying often gamble on the mercy of strangers because they have run out of anyone else. Marcus had inherited a fortune he believed was stolen. He had spent a year and a good part of his own money tracing the theft, hiring a discreet man in London to examine the solicitor's copies, riding himself to Kent to sit at the steward's bedside and take down the confession word by word before the man died, searching parish registers for the vicar who had signed and then been pensioned off to a distant living to keep him quiet. And he had come at last to the house itself to find the person the estate had been stolen from. Not knowing her name, knowing only that Sir Henry had meant to leave everything to someone the family had wished erased. He had found her keeping the very books that hid the crime, doing sums in a cold room, while the family who had robbed her called her a shadow and planned her exile to Northumberland. And he had understood within the week that the wronged party and the bookkeeper were the same frightened, upright girl. And then the wound came out of him, the old private one, because she had seen it move behind his eyes, and he would not let her keep guessing at it. There had been a woman once, years before, a woman he had loved and been prevented from marrying by his own family's calculations of rank and fortune, and he had let himself be prevented, being young and dutiful and certain there would be time to set it right. There had not been time. She had married where she was told, and died of a fever within 2 years, and the letter in his breast pocket was the last she had ever written him. Kept all this while as a reproach he inflicted upon himself, a reminder of what came of a man's staying silent to keep the peace with his family. He had sworn, standing over the news of her death, that he would never again let the arrangements of other people speak for him where his own conscience should speak. And here at Crossholt was another woman his family meant to sacrifice to their convenience, and this time he had come. This time he had refused the silence. This time he would not be too late. "Why did you not tell me?" she said. Her voice was not steady. "Because I did not know whether you were the wronged party, or the last of the thieves," he said. "And I could not risk the will until I knew which." And then he said low that he had known within a week which she was, and had gone on saying nothing only because he did not know how to tell a woman he had wronged by silence that he had come to undo it, and that somewhere in the weeks of watching her hold her dignity together in a house designed to break it, the undoing had stopped being about justice and become about her. She did not answer. She could not. The room had grown very small and very warm, and he had come around the desk without her marking that he had moved, and he stood close enough that she could see the pulse at his throat, and smell the rain still faint in his coat, and he lifted one hand and did not touch her. His fingers hovered at the edge of her jaw, near enough that she felt the warmth of them, and he let them fall without arriving, because to arrive was to ask a thing he had not earned the right to ask, and the not touching was louder in her blood than any touch could have been. "I want you," he said, and it was not gallant, and it was not smooth. It was torn out of him plainly the way a true thing comes. Not the house, not the setting right of it. "You!" And then he stepped back, deliberately, putting the distance between them again, because he would not have her mistake desire for the leverage of a man who held her future in his hands. There is a moment, she would think later, when a life turns on a hinge so small no one else can hear it. Hers turned in that cold study, in the space between his hand rising and his hand falling, and she did not yet know how she would answer him, only that the answer mattered more than the house ever had. She should have known the family would move first. Someone had listened at a door, or read her face at breakfast, or simply understood that a shadow who had stopped being frightened was a shadow about to become dangerous. On the morning she meant to take the true will to the magistrate. In the county town, she went to the loose board beneath her bed and found it pried up and the paper gone. She stood in her small, cold room with the empty hollow gaping at her feet, and felt the whole edifice of her hope go out like a snuffed candle. She knelt and put her hand into the space beneath the board as though the paper might have slid deeper, as though touch might contradict sight, and found only dust and the cold, rough underside of the floor. Someone had known. Someone had come into her room while she slept, or while she worked, had lifted the very board she had thought no one else in the house knew of, and had taken the one thing that stood between her and erasure, and had left the board crooked, not even troubling to set it back, because whoever had taken it no longer had any reason to fear her. Without the paper, she was a poor cousin with a wild story. The family had a signed will and a letter of character and a coach ordered for the following morning to carry her 300 miles from anyone who might listen, and now they had her proof as well, and she could not even go to Marcus, because to tell him it was gone was to watch the one door left to her close in his face, too. She sat back on her heels on the cold boards. She heard through the floor Lady Margaret's voice raised in bright welcome to the guests assembling for the evening's dinner, the last great dinner of the season. 30 at the table beneath the chandeliers, the county's carriages already turning in at the gates. She understood that they meant to send her away in the morning, with the whole neighborhood having seen her serve and smile and vanish, so that no story she ever told afterward would find any purchase anywhere, and that this was not cruelty, for its own sake, but something colder, the tidy administrative erasure of an inconvenience. That was the darkest hour, and she spent it on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands pressed to her mouth, and the old sentence rang in her ears in 3 voices. Now, Lady Margaret's and Cordelia's, and, worst of all, her own, because she had begun to wonder whether the family had been right all along. Whether a shadow was all she had ever been and all she would ever be, forgettable, useful, gone. Then she thought of Sir Henry's hand steady on a book in a warm room, correcting her Latin without unkindness, and she thought of the line he had written that no forger had ever seen, that he could not in conscience leave her to the mercy of people who would never see her worth. He had seen it, one man had seen it, and had written it down, and even if the writing was stolen, the seeing could not be. And she rose from the bed, and she washed her face, and she went down to the dinner she had been meant to serve at. Dressed in the one good gown she owned, to stand in the arena where the family had rendered its verdict, and to see whether anything at all could be made to answer. The dining room at Crossholt held 30 that night, beneath 100 candles, and the long table gleamed with silver that had been Sir Henry's, and would soon be sold, and Lady Margaret sat at its head in diamonds, with Cordelia at her right hand, and the county's best families ranged down its length. Eleanor came in at the door in her plain gown, and the conversation faltered and then resumed. Louder, the way a room covers an awkwardness. She had not been invited. Va. Lady Margaret's fan rose half an inch, the small, precise gesture of a woman recalculating, and she said, with perfect sweetness, that the poor child had mistaken the evening, and that a servant would show her to more suitable occupation. Marcus Ashcombe stood up. He was seated near the head of the table, in the place of honor. That was his by rank, and he rose from it without haste, and the room went quiet, the way a room does when a man of consequence declines to be quiet. He did not raise his voice. He said that Miss Vane had not mistaken the evening, and that she was to be seated at his hand, and that the county might as well hear from him directly what it would otherwise learn from the courts within the month. Then he told them. He told them of the steward's confession, and the year of tracing, and the true will witnessed and sworn to and then betrayed. And he named, without cruelty and without haste, the fact that the signature on the will now in the solicitor's keeping had been made by a hand that could not have made it, and that he had had it examined by a man in London who would swear to as much before any magistrate in England. Lady Margaret's fan had stopped moving, her mouth opened, and produced nothing. Cordelia had gone the color of the tablecloth. "You have no will," Lady Margaret said at last, and her voice fragmented on the words, because it was the one thing she was certain of. The paper pried from beneath a board and burned that very morning, in her own grate. "You have nothing. There is nothing." And Eleanor understood in that instant that Lady Margaret had just confessed, before 30 witnesses, to knowing precisely what had been taken and from where. Marcus let the silence hold. Then he said the thing that ended it, and he said it plainly. In 7 words, in the same room where she had been called a shadow, "I have the steward, and I have her." He held out his hand to her, across the space of the ruined table, and the whole county turned to see whether the poor cousin would take it, and Eleanor Vane, who had trained herself for years, never to reach for anything she might not be given, crossed the room, and put her hand in his. The magistrate came the following week, and the man from London swore to the forged hand. And the vicar, found at last in a living 2 counties distant, confirmed that he had witnessed Sir Henry sign a true will 8 months before his death, and had been told afterward that the old man had changed his mind, which he had thought strange and been too timid to question. The steward's written confession, kept all this while in Marcus's breast pocket, was laid before the court. And it was that letter, she realized, that folded paper he had carried like a grief, that had been the true weight against his heart the whole time. It had never been a keepsake. It had been the proof he could not yet use, and could not put down. Lady Margaret was not destroyed. That is not the way such things end, and Eleanor found she did not wish it. The forged will was set aside, and the true one, reconstructed from the vicar's witness and the steward's confession and the solicitor's own reluctant records, was upheld, and Lady Margaret was permitted to retire, quietly, and with what remained of her dignity, to a house in Bath that had been left her honestly. And Cordelia went back to town and married a baronet within the year, and spoke of Crossholt to no one. They were corrected. They were not broken. The world Sir Henry had believed in, just but slow, had come round at last to the truth of things. It was Sir Henry's true will in the end that gave Eleanor the house. It was not the house she thought of in the weeks after, when the guests were gone and the silver was not sold after all, and the ledgers balanced honestly, for the first time in a year. It was the line he had written that she had been the truest company of his last years. I'd ends. I? She had it framed at last, that single leaf of his firm and slanting hand, and she hung it in the library where the portrait had been, and she took the portrait down from over the hidden panel and set it where the morning light could reach it, so that the old man looked out now upon a warm room instead of a cold one. Marcus did not press her. He might have. A lesser man, having declared himself and then delivered her whole future into her hands, might have thought himself owed an answer, and might have collected it. He did not. Through the whole of that autumn he came and went as an honest man courts an equal. In the open, at proper distance, calling in the afternoons and leaving before dark, sitting with her in the library among the books that were hers now and disagreeing with her about them with a seriousness he offered to no one else. He brought her a volume of the poet she had first stumbled through for Sir Henry, and argued that the man was sentimental, and she defended the poet with a warmth that surprised them both, and something in his face, when she argued, was very near to happiness. She watched the cold thing in him thaw by small degrees, the way the northwood thawed that season, and she came to understand that his stillness had never been coldness at all, but the discipline of a man who had once let himself be governed, and had sworn never again to be governed by anything but his own conscience. Once, and only once, when they stood together in the north wood where the timber had been stolen and now grew back in thin green shoots among the stumps, he took her hand and did not let it fall. She looked down at his hand, around hers, and then up at his face, and she did not step away. The not touching that had lived so long between them, the hovering fingers and the held distance and the wanting neither had permitted, ended at last in a kiss, soft and full of a promise. Neither of them any longer troubled to deny, there in the cold bright air with the young trees rising around them. By the first snow they were married, quietly, in the small church where the vicar who had witnessed the truth read the words over them, and there was no crowd, only the household and a handful of tenants who had loved the old man and now loved the girl who had kept his books through the cold. The house at Crossholt filled with firelight that winter as it had not filled in years. The long corridors warm again. The tenants come up at Christmas to a table that welcomed them. The pension Sir Henry had paid in secret, now paid openly and without shame. Snow fell past the tall library windows, slow and steady, softening the park where the carriages had once turned in to render their verdicts. And on the mantel beneath the framed leaf of Sir Henry's own hand, a single candle burned late into the evening, the way he had liked to keep one burning when he read. And Eleanor sat beside it in a warm room that was hers and was seen and did not have to weep silently ever again. If Eleanor's story stayed with you, tell me the moment that held you longest, and let it remind you that the quiet ones in the corners of the world are so often the ones who see everything. Thank you for staying until the very end.